Hi everyone, today I want to show you how to crochet the Drunken Granny Stitch. Now this stitch is a take on the granny stripe but with a quirk that makes it just that little bit more interesting. It gets its name from the slanted way that your granny clusters are worked, and it works brilliantly for a scarf like I'm working on here, or for blankets if you worked it in stripes. And not only that, it works brilliantly in really lovely chunky yarn or in fingering weight yarn like I'm using on this scarf here. So without further ado, grab your hook, grab some yarn, and let's get crocheting. The pattern multiple for the Drunken Granny Stitch is 5 plus 4. That means that you want to make a foundation chain that is in multiples of 5 and then add 4 stitches on to the end of that chain. You can chain as wide or as slender as you want, but for today's tutorial, as I'm only making a sample, I'm going to go ahead and chain 29. The Drunken Granny Stitch is a 1-row repeat, so after we have worked this first row, every row onwards from the second row upwards is worked in exactly the same way. The stitch pattern for the first row is the same, but because we're working into the foundation chain, it's just worked slightly differently. So to start your Drunken Granny Stitch, you want to go ahead and crochet it into the 6th chain from your hook. Don't forget, this one up here does not count, so you want to count 6 chains from your hook and then work a double crochet into that 6th chain from your hook. Then into the same chain you want to work 2 more double crochets so that you have a cluster of 3. Then you want to chain 2 and still working into that same chain stitch, you want to pop 1 final double crochet. Then you want to skip the next 4 chains. Now this chain here, just after the one we worked into, can sometimes tighten up quite a bit because we have stretched this chain that we've worked into quite a lot. So make sure when you're counting, you're not missing that stitch if it has tightened up and gets a little bit hidden. So again, miss the next 4 chains and into the 5th chain along, we're again going to work that cluster combination of 3 double crochet, chain 2, 1 double crochet, all into the same stitch. And you repeat that all the way along your row. So we're going to skip the next 4 and into the 5th chain along, we're working 3 double crochet, chain 2, 1 double crochet. And you want to repeat that until you have 3 chains left of your foundation chain. When you have 3 chains left of your foundation chain, instead of working a cluster combination into that final chain, you're going to skip 2 chains and work a double crochet into that final chain stitch. And that completes our setup row. Now from row 2 onwards, every row is exactly the same. So you want to chain 3 and turn your work. Then into the first chain 2 space that we come to, so we don't work into this first gap here because there's no chain spaces, but into the first chain 2 gap from the row below, we want to work our 3 double crochet, chain 2, 1 double crochet combo. So 3 double crochet, chain 2 and 1 double crochet. Then we ignore the next 3 double crochet, we ignore the gap between the double crochet and the 3 double crochet because there's no chain spaces, and we want to find the next chain 2 gap along from the row below, and into that gap we do the same as we've done previously, 3 double crochet, chain 2, 1 double crochet. And working only into those chain 2 gaps, you want to work all the way along your row until you've worked into the last chain 2 gap from the row below. When you reach the end of the row, into the top of the last unworked chain from your beginning of your first row, you want to work a double crochet. If you struggle working into the top of chain stitches, you can work into the gap, but personally I find that I get a neater edge up my scarf or project if I am working into the turning chain from the row below as opposed to the gap that it is creating. So into that chain, the final chain from the turning chain of the row below, you want to work a double crochet. So just to recap, your repeat row is as follows. You chain 3 and turn your work. You are ignoring any gaps that don't have a chain 2 space. We don't want to work into those. And we're going to work our Drunken Granny clusters only into the chain 2 spaces. And just as a recap, our Drunken Granny clusters are a combination of 3 double crochet, chain 2, 1 double crochet. So ignore this space here because there's no chain stitches, work into the next chain 2 gap along, 3 double crochet, chain 2, 1 double crochet. And just like before, once you've worked into that final chain 2 gap from the row below, you're going to work 1 solitary double crochet into the final chain of your chain 3 turn from the row below. If you are working a project that you want to work in stripes rather than in variegated yarn like I'm using today, what you would do when you want to change colour is you would finish this double crochet with the new colour. So you would start your double crochet and work your yarn over, pull through 2 so that you have 2 loops left on your hook, and then you would introduce the new colour, finish this double crochet off with the new colour, and then carry on and chain 3 and carry on working your project until you're ready to change colour again. By finishing off your double crochet with the new colour, it just gives a really nice, neat and tidy colour change. I'm going to go now and make this sample a little bit bigger because there is a tweak at the end of the project that I like to use, which works particularly well if you're working something like a scarf, because it just by working one final row, it means that you get a pretty symmetrical top and bottom, because if you don't work that row, you don't have your little chains at the top here. And I just think that this one final row that you can add if you want to just gives you a little bit more symmetry in your work, which is particularly important when you're working with something like a scarf. When you've reached a stage in your project that you are finished, you're ready to end your work, you've got 2 choices. One, you can break your yarn, pull your yarn through and sew in your ends. That's absolutely fine. And if you're working something like a blanket where you're going to pop an edge onto the finished item, then that's probably what I do. But when I am working a scarf in Drunken Granny Stitch, I like to replicate these chain stitches that we got on the beginning of our work at the top, because as you can see here at the moment, the top doesn't quite match the bottom, and I'm a sucker for the details, so I like it just to match top and bottom, particularly when it's a scarf. So this optional finishing row goes as follows. You chain 2, turn your work, and into the chain 2 gap from the row below you want to pop a slip stitch. Then you want to chain 4 and find the next chain 2 gap along, and again pop your hook in and pop a slip stitch, and all the way along till the last chain 2 gap you're going to do that. So you're going to chain 4, pop your hook in that gap and work a slip stitch. When you've reached the end of your chain 2 gaps that you've been able to work into, you want to chain 2, and into the gap between the turning chain and the set of 3 double crochets from the previous row, you're going to just pop 1 final slip stitch. And you can see by doing that, whilst it's not exactly symmetrical because you can't ever replicate the beginning foundation chain and how it looks, it does give those chains top and bottom, so it just gives it a little bit more symmetry. But like I said, that's optional. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. It's just what I like to do. And that's how you crochet the Drunken Granny Stitch. I've left written instructions on my blog for those of you that like to have something written down to follow along with while you're crocheting, and I really hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you have, please drop me a comment. I love to hear from you all, and I'll see you again for another tutorial soon. Bye!